Hey everyone, and welcome to this Explainer. Today, we're doing something pretty wild. We are taking a fascinating journey through time to completely dismantle some of the most widely accepted biblical myths. We're going to look strictly at the historical, linguistic, and artistic records to uncover the shocking realities behind the cultural stories you thought you knew for sure. So let's just dive right into this. What if I told you that some of the most famous imagery and even foundational stories that you associate with the Bible are literally nowhere to be found in its pages? Seriously. What if Mary Magdalene was never a prostitute? Or what if Eve never actually ate an apple? We are going to explore how centuries of art, translation shifts, and honestly, just simple human error have dramatically shaped and, in many cases, totally distorted our deeply ingrained cultural beliefs.
All right, let's kick things off with part 1, visualizing the myths.
For our first myth, let's head straight to the Garden of Eden. The idea of the forbidden apple is practically universally accepted today, right? But here is the crazy reality. The apple is completely absent from the original Hebrew text of Genesis. The text simply uses the word peri, which is really just a generic term for any seed-bearing fruit. In fact, many early Italian Renaissance paintings, including Michelangelo's massive fresco in the Sistine Chapel, actually depict a fig tree. And you know, that makes a whole lot more sense, considering Adam and Eve clothed themselves in fig leaves immediately afterward. I mean, an apple leaf wouldn't exactly offer much coverage.
So, where did the apple come from? Well, the root of this myth actually comes down to a giant linguistic pun. When St. Jerome translated the Bible into the Latin Vulgate back in the 4th century, he translated the generic fruit as fructus. But for the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, he utilized the Latin word for evil, which is malum. Later European writers and artists heavily leaned into the similarity between that Latin word for evil and the completely unrelated Latin word for apple, which is also malum. It was basically an irresistible play on words that stuck.
And this linguistic shift combined perfectly with popular art to cement the myth forever. See, in early French and English, words like palm and apple were just generic, catch-all terms for any fleshy fruit. As the language evolved, apple narrowed down to mean the specific fruit we know today, which retroactively changed how people read those older texts. Then, in 1504, Albrecht Dürer created a super famous engraving depicting Adam and Eve beside an actual apple tree. By 1550, thanks to the printing press, the specific image spread like wildfire across Europe, permanently transforming our visual understanding of the Garden of Eden.
Moving right along, let's talk about the ultimate bad guy. When you picture the devil, you likely picture a red humanoid figure with cloven hooves, horns, a pointed tail, and a pitchfork. We all do. But the reality here is striking. The Bible provides absolutely zero physical description of Satan. None. Instead, it uses strictly metaphorical language, describing the adversary as a great red dragon, a roaring lion, or even warning that he can disguise himself as an angel of light.
So, this cartoonish character design actually evolved over centuries. It's literally a cultural collage. Artists needed a way to make invisible evil visible to everyday people. So, they borrowed horns and hooves from classical mythology to show a sort of distortion of the human form. The pitchfork? That likely evolved from an agricultural winnowing fork mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew, mashed up with Poseidon's trident. The red skin came straight out of medieval theater costumes. And the wildest part? All of these elements were finally standardized by early 20th century advertisements and a 1918 anti-German propaganda poster. It turns out, our ultimate image of cosmic evil was largely designed by modern marketing.
Okay, let's shift gears into part 2, Lost in Translation.
First up in this section, we've got to address this bizarre internet conspiracy theory floating around. It claims that the name Jesus is actually a pagan code designed to invoke the Greek god Zeus, like Hail Zeus. In reality, this is completely false. The name Jesus is simply the result of a massive, multi-tiered linguistic game of telephone that was governed entirely by standard linguistic rules as Christianity moved from a Semitic-speaking world out into a Greco-Roman one.
These phonetic compromises across expanding empires were just absolutely inevitable. In 1st century Judea, the historical figure was actually named Yeshua, which was a very common name meaning Yahweh is salvation. But Koine Greek lacks a sh sound, so translators substituted an s. Greek grammar also required masculine names to end in an s, making it Iesus. That then translated into the Latin Jesus. And honestly, it wasn't until the 17th century in English when the letter J finally acquired its distinct hard consonant sound that we arrive at the modern pronunciation, Jesus.
Let's look at another famous saying. The popular claim that when Jesus talked about a camel going through the eye of a needle being easier than a rich man entering heaven, he was actually referring to a specific, super narrow gate in Jerusalem. The legend says a camel could only squeeze through this gate if it was completely unloaded of all its baggage. It's a really nice sermon illustration, but the reality, it was just a hyperbolic comparison. There is zero archaeological evidence that any such gate ever existed in first-century Jerusalem.
Historians have actually traced this myth back to commentators who lived hundreds of years later. The theory seems to originate way later in the 13th century with a Dominican friar named Hugh of St. Cher, or maybe with a 15th century pilgrim named Joannes Poloner. These later writers essentially fabricated the gate to soften a notoriously difficult teaching. They took an impossible, totally absurd image, literally the largest animal in the region trying to fit through a tiny sewing needle, and turned it into a mere inconvenience.
Which brings us to part 3, rewriting church history.
Perhaps the most tragic case of mistaken identity surrounds Mary Magdalene. From famous musicals to popular culture, she is universally known as a repentant prostitute. Yet the Bible never, not once, describes her as a sex worker. In the original texts, she is a primary leader, a fiercely devoted disciple, and famously, the very first witness to the resurrection. So how on earth did she become known as a fallen woman?
Well, this massive misconception wasn't a translation error. It was a documented human decision. It was officially sealed on September 14, 591 AD, when Pope Gregory the Great delivered a highly influential sermon in Rome. In it, he erroneously conflated 3 completely distinct biblical women into one person: Mary of Magdala, Mary of Bethany, and an unnamed sinful woman who washed Jesus' feet in the Gospel of Luke. Now, the Eastern Orthodox Church never fell for this fallacy and continued to honor her true biblical portrait, but the Western Church, they remembered her as a prostitute for over 1,400 years.
Moving to our final myth, and this one is a real paradigm shifter. Many people are shocked to learn that the concept of the rapture, the idea that believers will be secretly taken off the earth before a time of massive global tribulation, is not a historic Christian doctrine. In fact, it was completely unknown to mainstream Christian theology across Catholic, Orthodox, and Protestant traditions for the first 1,800 years of church history.
It's a surprisingly modern invention. For 18 centuries, the Church anticipated a single, visible return of Christ. But then in the 1830s, an Anglo-Irish preacher named John Nelson Darby formulated a totally novel theological framework called dispensationalism, which required the Church to be secretly removed from the earth. This idea really didn't gain massive traction until it was popularized in America in the 20th century by the Schofield Reference Bible. Fueled by all the anxieties of the Civil War and then 2 world wars, this 19th century invention offered a comforting escape plan and very quickly became a cultural phenomenon in the United States.
Wow. We've peeled back the layers of art, language, and history to uncover the actual realities behind these myths. Which leaves us with a pretty fascinating question. If centuries of art and translation can completely reshape the core characters and imagery of these ancient texts, what other modern assumptions are we getting totally wrong? Tell me in the comments which of these facts surprised you the absolute most, and I'll see you in the next explainer.